My knees were currently engaged in a high-stakes turf war with my chin, and my chin was losing. That tends to happen when a 6'2" grown man is violently wedged into a neon-yellow, injection-molded plastic chair designed exclusively for a toddler. A lukewarm clump of garlic truffle mashed potatoes sailed past my left ear, missing my temple by a fraction of an inch before aggressively splattering against the dining room's custom-flocked damask wallpaper. "Direct hit, Jackson!" screeched my 7-year-old nephew, practically vibrating with sugar-fueled adrenaline as he high-fived his 5-year-old brother Leo. Leo didn't even notice. He was too busy trying to force the serrated edge of a butter knife through the plastic bottom of his organic apple juice box. "Whoa there, Elias!" The booming, hyper-confident voice echoed across the cavernous dining room, cutting through the symphony of clinking silverware and smooth jazz playing from the hidden ceiling speakers. I didn't even need to look up from the sticky, syrup-coated surface of my miniature table to know it was Julian. My beloved brother-in-law was holding court at the head of the 20-foot, hand-carved mahogany dining table, swirling a glass of Pinot Noir that cost more than my first car. "Don't let the boys rough you up too much over there!" Julian shouted, a malicious grin plastered across his perfectly tanned face. "We didn't bring your shin guards. If you need a timeout, just raise your hand." Laughter erupted from the main table. It was that rich, throaty, unbothered country club laughter that only comes from people who have never had to check their bank account balance before buying groceries. Julian's sycophantic cousins chuckled into their linen napkins. His mother, the family matriarch, let out an amused sigh, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. I ignored the searing spike of humiliation burning in my chest and looked across the massive expanse of the room. I looked past the towering, absurdly lavish autumnal floral centerpieces. I looked past the gleaming sterling silver gravy boats and the golden chargers. I looked right at Vanessa, my wife. She was sitting 3 seats down from Julian, looking radiant in a dark green silk dress that I had bought her for our anniversary. I caught her eye. I poured every ounce of my frustration, my exhaustion, and my shattered dignity into that single look. I was drowning in her family's cruelty, suffocating under the weight of their relentless, casual disrespect. I needed her to throw me a lifeline. I needed her to stand up, just this once, and say, "That's enough. That's my husband." Vanessa met my gaze. Her beautiful, manicured face hardened for a fraction of a second. She didn't stand up. She didn't defend me. Instead, she offered a tight, condescending little grimace, subtly rolled her eyes, and mouthed 3 words to me across the room. "Just keep the peace." Then she turned back to the man on her right, laughing musically at whatever vapid joke he had just told. Something deep inside my chest, something that had been fraying and snapping thread by thread over the last 6 years, finally severed completely. It was a terrifyingly quiet sensation. No explosions, no dramatic gasps, just a sudden absolute stillness in my mind. I looked back down at the children's table. Leo had successfully breached the hull of his juice box, and a sticky, yellow puddle was slowly creeping toward my elbows. I didn't even try to move away. I just sat there in my ill-fitting suit, marooned on an island of primary colors and spilled food, and let the reality of my pathetic existence wash over me. I didn't grow up like the Sterlings. I grew up in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment above a noisy laundromat where the heating was a suggestion and dinner was usually whatever was on clearance at the local bodega. But what I lacked in generational wealth, I made up for with my brain. Numbers made sense to me. Algorithms, market trends, statistical probabilities. They were a language I spoke fluently. By the time I was 22, I had a full-ride scholarship to an Ivy League university and a brain that hedge funds were trying to buy for absurd amounts of money. That was where I met Vanessa. She was playing the role of the rebellious heiress, slumming it with the brilliant broke scholarship kid. I fell for it. I fell for her. I thought we were a team, a partnership built on genuine love that transcended her family's terrifying bank accounts. I was an idiot. The moment we got married, her rebellion conveniently faded. She wanted the lifestyle her family provided, and I, blinded by love and a desperate desire to prove I belonged, became the Sterling family's most useful, heavily abused asset. For 6 years. 6 agonizing, soul-crushing years. I was the secret workhorse pulling the opulent carriage of the Sterling empire. The world thought Julian was a financial prodigy, a golden boy with the Midas touch. The truth was, Julian was a catastrophic moron. He was a bloated ego in a bespoke suit who couldn't balance a checkbook without throwing a temper tantrum. My mind drifted to the Catalyst Capital disaster just 14 months ago. Julian, in a fit of cocaine-fueled arrogance, had leveraged $40 million of the family's liquid trust on a phantom offshore crypto mining farm that didn't actually exist. He had fallen for a Ponzi scheme so glaringly obvious that a high school accounting student would have flagged it. When the margin calls started coming in, Julian had literally shown up at my front door at 3 a.m, weeping on my porch, begging me to fix it before Grandpa Richard found out and stripped him of his executive title. I didn't sleep for 4 days. I built complex algorithms to trace the shell companies, unwound the disastrous leverage through a series of shadow accounts, and buried the catastrophic losses in a brilliantly convoluted web of tax-harvesting maneuvers. I saved the company. I saved his inheritance. And what was my reward? Julian got a brand new Porsche 911 GT3 for weathering a volatile quarter with visionary leadership. I got a pat on the back, a lecture from Vanessa about not making Julian feel insecure about his intelligence, and a permanent assigned seat at the children's table for every major family holiday. Because, according to the Sterlings, I lacked the refined pedigree necessary to sit with the adults and discuss the business that I was secretly keeping afloat. I was their fixer, their janitor. I cleaned up their messes, and in return they wiped their designer shoes on my dignity. And Vanessa let them. No, worse than that, she expected it. I had spent 6 years setting myself on fire just to keep her family warm, and she wouldn't even pass me a glass of water. "Hey, Elias!" Julian's voice snapped me back to the present. The dining room had quieted down, the main course having been cleared by the silent, white-gloved waitstaff. "Since you're down there in the trenches, be a good sport and wipe Jackson's face, would you? He's got gravy in his eyebrows. We don't want him ruining the upholstery in the Bentley on the ride home." Jackson, on cue, blew a raspberry at me, spraying a fine mist of spit and chewed-up turkey across the sleeve of my only decent suit jacket. I slowly blinked, staring at the flecks of meat on my cuff. A week ago, I would have forced a polite laugh, grabbed a napkin, and played the role of the good-natured, subservient clown. I would have swallowed the rage like I always did, letting it rot a little more of my soul. But not today. Deep in the right pocket of my trousers, my phone emitted a single, sharp buzz. I didn't rush. I casually reached into my pocket, keeping my face entirely blank, and pulled the phone into my lap, shielding the screen under the sticky edge of the plastic table. It was an encrypted message from Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance wasn't just a corporate attorney, he was an apex predator in a tailored suit. He was the most feared, ruthless, and tight-lipped legal mind on the eastern seaboard. He was also the only man Grandpa Richard Sterling had ever truly trusted. I stared at the glowing screen. The message was short. 2 sentences that held the concussive power of a nuclear warhead. Filing is complete with the probate court. The trap is officially set. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. A cold, calculated baring of teeth. Grandpa Richard had died 32 days ago. The family had mourned for exactly 20 minutes before the vicious, feral squabbling over his $4 billion empire began. They were currently sitting at that mahogany table, drinking his wine, sitting in his house, prematurely carving up his legacy like greedy vultures. What they didn't know, what no one in this room of arrogant, entitled parasites knew, was that during the last year of his life, when they were all too busy yachting in St. Bart's or networking in Aspen to visit the dying patriarch, I was the one sitting by his bedside. We played chess. We talked strategy. And eventually, when the cancer made him too weak to pretend anymore, we talked about the truth. He knew. He knew about Julian's embezzlement. He knew about the failing investments. He knew exactly who had been the architect of his company's survival for the last 6 years. And more importantly, he knew I possessed the one thing his own bloodline utterly lacked: absolute, unyielding competence. "Elias!" Julian barked again, his tone dropping the faux-friendly banter and shifting into a sharp, commanding edge, the edge of a master talking to a servant. "I said wipe the kid's face. Are you deaf or just slow tonight?" Vanessa shot me a sharp, warning glare. "Do it!" her eyes screamed. "Don't you dare ruin this dinner!" I didn't look at her. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. On the tiny table in front of me sat a paper plate holding a single, cold, dinosaur-shaped chicken nugget. It looked pathetic. It looked exactly like the life I had been living. I picked up the cold nugget, popped it into my mouth, and chewed slowly. It tasted like compressed sawdust and stale fryer oil. I swallowed, wiped my mouth with a brightly colored Paw Patrol napkin, and took a deep, steadying breath. The peace was officially over. Let the war begin. The stale taste of the dinosaur chicken nugget lingered on my tongue, but in my mind, I was tasting something else entirely. The smoky, peat-heavy bite of a 50-year-old Macallan single malt. It was the scotch Grandpa Richard used to pour for me during the long, quiet nights in the east wing of the estate, far away from the pathetic circus the rest of the family called a life. Richard Sterling had not been a good man. He would have been the first to tell you that. He was a shark who had built a $4 billion global shipping and logistics empire by swallowing his competitors whole and spitting out the bones. His own children terrified him, not because of any physical threat, but because of their staggering, breathtaking incompetence. He used to say that building the Sterling Empire took a lifetime of war, but dismantling it would only take his heirs a long weekend in Vegas. For the last year of his life, as aggressive pancreatic cancer hollowed him out from the inside, his family practically installed a countdown clock in the foyer. Robert, my father-in-law, started picking out new curtains for the executive boardroom. Julian spent his days test-driving yachts in Monaco, banking on his impending inheritance. Even my wife, Vanessa, spent hours on the phone with real estate agents, looking for a larger summer home in the Hamptons. They visited Richard only when it was socially mandated, wearing appropriately solemn faces while secretly measuring the drapes. I was the only one who actually showed up. At first, I went out of a misplaced sense of duty. I felt bad for the old man, dying in a sterile, temperature-controlled fortress surrounded by hired nurses, while his bloodline circled like vultures. But very quickly, our visits became something else. They became a sanctuary. For him, I was the only person in the house who didn't look at him like a piñata waiting to burst open. For me, he was the only Sterling who possessed a brain capable of operating above room temperature. We played chess. Real chess. Not the polite, let the old man win garbage his sons engaged in. I played to slaughter him on the board, and he respected nothing less. "You play like a man with a knife at his throat, Elias," Richard had rasped one evening in late August, moving his bishop to trap my knight. His skin was the color of old parchment, drawn tight over his skull, and the steady hiss of the oxygen concentrator provided a constant, morbid rhythm to our games. "I play like a man who knows the board is rigged, Richard," I replied, sliding my rook across the polished mahogany squares, neatly decapitating his trap. "Check." He had wheezed out a laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "My family hates you. You know that, right? They think you're a stray dog Vanessa brought in from the rain." "I know exactly what they think of me," I said, my eyes fixed on the board. "I'm the janitor. I sweep up the mess." "And you let them treat you like one," he challenged, his pale, hawkish eyes locking onto mine. "Why? A man with your mind could have gutted Julian's entire portfolio and fed it to the dogs 3 years ago. Yet you sit there, balancing his books, eating their scraps. Why, Elias? Is it love?" He spat the word, as if it were a foul taste. "Is it Vanessa?" I hadn't answered him right away. The truth was ugly, wrapped up in years of psychological conditioning and a desperate, pathetic desire for a family I never had. But Richard didn't need an answer. He saw right through the silence. It was exactly 3 months ago, during a brutally hot night in September, that the foundation of the Sterling family finally cracked, and I was the one holding the hammer. I was sitting in my cramped home office at 2 a.m. Vanessa was asleep in the master bedroom, dead to the world after a grueling day of wine tastings and spa appointments. I, as usual, was awake, desperately trying to reconcile the quarterly financial reports for Sterling Logistics. Something wasn't adding up. The company's core shipping division, the beating heart of the empire, managed directly by Robert, was bleeding capital at an unprecedented rate. But that wasn't the terrifying part. Companies have bad quarters. They take on debt. But the numbers staring back at me from the encrypted ledgers weren't just bad. They were fictional. I dug deeper, bypassing the internal firewall, using a back door I had installed years ago, when I realized Julian's accounting practices were less standard GAAP and more creative writing. I spent 6 hours tracing a labyrinth of synthetic derivatives and mezzanine debt. By sunrise, I had unearthed the full, horrifying picture. Robert wasn't just losing money. He was running the company into the ground, covering his massive, unserviceable operational deficits by secretly leveraging the company's primary physical assets, the shipping fleet itself. He had taken out massive, predatory loans using the cargo ships as collateral, falsifying the board's approval signatures. He was a captain setting fire to his own ship to keep his hands warm. But Robert's staggering incompetence paled in comparison to what Julian was doing. While auditing the leveraged assets, I noticed a discrepancy in the employee pension fund. At first, it looked like a standard clerical error, a rounding issue spread across a few thousand accounts. But the algorithm I wrote to isolate the anomalies began to scream. Julian wasn't just making bad investments. He was actively, systematically draining the company's pension fund. I traced the wire transfers. Small, steady drips of capital siphoned off every Friday at 4:55 p.m., routed through a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, bounced through a crypto exchange in Malta, and finally deposited into private, untraceable accounts. Over the last 4 years, Julian had stolen $120 million from the retirement accounts of the men and women who actually drove the trucks, loaded the ships, and built the company. If this got out, it wouldn't just mean bankruptcy. It meant federal prison. It meant the SEC, the FBI, and a complete thermonuclear dismantling of the Sterling name. And when the feds came knocking, Julian, the coward that he was, would undoubtedly try to pin the entire architecture of the fraud on his head of accounting. Me. I didn't panic. The icy calm that I had felt building for 6 years finally solidified into a glacier. I printed every ledger, every wire transfer receipt, Vossos Spartucite, every forged signature. I loaded a secure hard drive with the digital forensics. I didn't go to Vanessa. I knew her loyalty was to the name, not to the truth, and certainly not to me. Instead, the next night, under the cover of darkness, I drove to the east wing of the Sterling estate. Richard was having a bad night. The nurses were hovering, adjusting morphine drips and checking vitals. When I walked in, carrying my thick leather briefcase, he waved them out with a trembling, furious flick of his wrist. "You look like a man arriving at a funeral," Richard murmured, his voice faint, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. "I'm arriving at an execution," I said softly, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I pulled a chair to his bedside, opened my laptop, and placed it on his lap. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't pad the blow. I walked him through the numbers with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal tumor. I showed him Robert's catastrophic leverage. I showed him Julian's blatant sociopathic thievery. I watched the old man's face as he stared at the screen. I expected sorrow. I expected the devastation of a father realizing his life's work had been destroyed by his own flesh and blood. Instead, what I saw was pure, unadulterated wrath. Richard didn't cry. He didn't gasp. He just stared at the glowing numbers, his breathing growing shallow and fast, the heart monitor beside him accelerating into a frantic, high-pitched rhythm. For a moment, I thought the sheer rage might kill him on the spot. 120 million, Richard whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, venomous clarity. He stole from the pensions, the absolute, spineless, pathetic little worm. He slowly looked up from the screen, his eyes locking onto mine. The sickness seemed to vanish for a fleeting second, replaced by the ruthless billionaire who had crushed shipping unions in the 80s and bankrupted rivals without blinking. "They think I am already dead," Richard sneered, his hands gripping the bedsheets until his knuckles turned white. "They think the empire is theirs to butcher. Robert is an imbecile who couldn't manage a lemonade stand, and Julian is a common thief playing dress-up in my suits." He fell back against the pillows, panting, his chest heaving. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic pumping of the oxygen machine. "What do you want to do, Richard?" I asked quietly. He turned his head to look at me. "Arthur Vance. Call him. Get him here tonight. Use my private line." When Arthur Vance arrived an hour later, stepping into the hospice room with his perfectly tailored midnight blue suit and an expression made of carved granite, the atmosphere shifted. Vance had been Richard's legal attack dog for 40 years. He took one look at the financial dossiers I had laid out on the table and let out a low, humorless whistle. "It's a federal crime scene, Richard," Vance said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "If the SEC catches wind of this, the company will be seized, assets frozen, and your son and grandson will be in federal custody by the end of the fiscal year." "I don't care about their freedom, Arthur," Richard spat, coughing violently into a napkin. "I care about the company. I care about the legacy. I will not let those parasites burn down what I built to cover their own incompetence." Richard pointed a trembling, skeletal finger at me. "Elias found it. Elias understands the board. He understands the mechanics of the machine. He is the only one who has ever understood." "Richard," Vance cautioned gently, "you have a standing will. The trust is ironclad, distributed evenly among Robert, Julian, and Vanessa. Overturning it now, in your condition, they will contest it. They will claim you were not of sound mind. They will tie it up in probate court for a decade." "Then we don't just change the will, Arthur," Richard smiled, a ghastly, terrifying expression that sent a chill down my spine. "We build a trap so perfect, so airtight, that when the jaws snap shut, they won't even have the legal standing to hire a lawyer." For the next 4 hours, the three of us drafted the countermeasure. It was a masterpiece of legal and financial engineering, a weaponized trust document designed for maximum devastation. First, Richard secretly liquidated his private, unattached assets, nearly $1 billion in offshore holdings, and transferred them into a blind trust controlled entirely by me. This gave me the capital needed to immediately plug the hole Julian had torn in the pension fund, saving the company from federal seizure. Second, we enacted a poison pill clause regarding Robert's management. By utilizing a loophole in the corporate bylaws, Richard transferred absolute voting control of his supervoting shares not to his son, but to a holding company that I had incorporated the previous day. And finally, the will, the piece de résistance. Richard didn't just disinherit them, he weaponized their own greed against them. He left the existing trust structure seemingly intact, allowing them to believe they had won. But he embedded a fatal contingency, triggered only upon the reading of the final, secretly filed addendum. A fidelity clause for Vanessa, a fiduciary compliance clause for Robert, and a criminal conduct clause for Julian. When they fail, and they have already failed, Richard whispered, signing the heavy parchment documents with a gold fountain pen, his hand shaking with effort. Everything defaults. Every share, every property, every dime. He handed the pen back to Vance and slumped back, utterly exhausted, the life visibly draining from him. But his eyes were locked on mine, burning with a fierce, dark satisfaction. "Elias," Richard rasped, reaching out and gripping my wrist with surprising strength. His skin was freezing cold. "They have treated you like dirt. They have used you. They think you are nothing." "I know," I said. "Take it all," the old man hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "When the time comes, do not show them mercy. Do not give them a single inch. Burn them, Elias. Burn them all to the ground, and build something better on the ashes." "I promise, Richard," I said, and meant every single word. He died 3 weeks later. The family threw a lavish funeral, entirely catered, complete with an open bar. Julian gave a eulogy that sounded more like a self-congratulatory pitch to the board of directors. Robert spent the wake introducing himself as the new chairman. Vanessa cried exactly 3 tears for the cameras, and then went back to complaining about the humidity ruining her hair. Through it all, I stood in the background, holding Vanessa's coat, fetching drinks, playing the role of the quiet, subservient husband. I let them preen, I let them strut, I let them measure the curtains, because I knew what was in Arthur Vance's briefcase. The sharp clinking of a knife against crystal shattered my reverie, snapping me violently back to the present. I blinked, the sterile smell of the hospice room fading, replaced by the overwhelming aroma of roasted turkey, expensive wine, and suffocating entitlement. I was back at the children's table. My knees still ached. Jackson was still throwing peas. Julian had stood up at the head of the massive dining table. He was holding his wine glass high, his face flushed with alcohol, and the intoxicating thrill of unchallenged power. The ambient chatter of the dining room died down instantly. The family turned their rapt attention to the golden boy, waiting for him to bestow his wisdom. "Family," Julian began, his voice dripping with practiced theatrical warmth. "This is our first Thanksgiving without the patriarch. Grandpa Richard built an empire with his bare hands. But it's up to us, the next generation, to steer this magnificent ship into the future." Murmurs of agreement rippled across the table. Robert puffed out his chest. Vanessa smiled warmly. "It's a heavy burden," Julian continued, placing a hand dramatically over his heart. "The markets are volatile. The responsibilities are immense. But looking around this table, at the pedigree, the talent, the sheer brilliance in this room, I know we are more than capable." He paused, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips as his eyes drifted past the floral centerpieces and locked directly onto me, sitting in my neon-yellow toddler chair. "And of course," Julian said, raising his glass slightly higher, his voice dripping with condescending venom, "we have to thank those who support us behind the scenes. Let's raise a glass to Elias, everyone. He's down there in the trenches, babysitting the kids and keeping the juice boxes flowing, ensuring that the actual adults in the room have the peace and quiet they need to discuss the future of the Sterling legacy. To Elias, the best nanny a billionaire family could ask for. The table erupted into laughter. It wasn't polite laughter. It was roaring, malicious, unrestrained mockery. Robert chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. Julian's cousins clinked their glasses together, turning in their seats to point and openly jeer at me. I looked at Vanessa. She was laughing too. A delicate, tinkling laugh, holding a hand over her mouth to hide her amusement as she looked at her husband, humiliated and minimized in front of her entire bloodline. I didn't flush with anger. I didn't look down at my shoes. I just sat there, perfectly still, letting the wave of their contempt wash over me. It didn't hurt anymore. It just felt like validation. Deep in my pocket, my phone gave a single, sharp vibration. I didn't need to look at it, but I did. I pulled it out slowly, letting the screen illuminate the sticky plastic surface of my miniature table. It was the follow-up text from Arthur Vance. Filing complete. The trap is set. The court had officially processed the addendum. The poison pills were armed. The silent transfer of power was now an irrevocable legal reality. In the eyes of the law, the state, and the federal government, the people laughing at me in this dining room were currently trespassing on my property, drinking my wine, and sitting on my furniture. I looked up from the screen. Julian was still grinning, holding his glass in the air, waiting for me to bow my head and accept the humiliation like a good little dog. I smiled back. It was a terrifying, genuine smile. I picked up my tiny plastic Paw Patrol cup filled with tepid apple juice, raised it toward Julian in a silent mock toast, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Let them laugh. In about 3 minutes, the Sterling family was going to find out that the ship they thought they were steering had already hit the iceberg, and I was the only one holding the keys to the lifeboats. The roaring laughter from Julian's toast took its time dying down, echoing off the vaulted, hand-painted ceiling of the dining room, like the cackling of hyenas over a fresh carcass. The rest of the Sterling clan eagerly drank it in, sipping their $1,000 wines, their faces flushed with the intoxicating cocktail of wealth, privilege, and the casual cruelty they passed off as familial banter. Outside, the weather seemed to perfectly mirror the frigid, unforgiving atmosphere within the estate. A brutal November storm was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the freezing rain driving hard against the reinforced glass, rattling the heavy brass frames. It was the kind of bitter, bone-chilling downpour that turned the sprawling manicured lawns into a freezing mud pit and made the warmth of the roaring marble fireplace in the dining room feel like a fortified sanctuary against the world of the less fortunate. Julian finally sat down, looking immensely pleased with himself, swirling his Pinot Noir, while his mother patted his hand in adoration. The conversation at the main table slowly pivoted away from my humiliation and back to their favorite subject, themselves. They discussed the impending restructuring of the company, divvying up Grandpa Richard's assets like pirates squabbling over a buried treasure map they hadn't even dug up yet. Robert, my father-in-law, was holding court at the center of the table, his chest puffed out under his tailored Italian suit. He was already speaking in the royal we, outlining his grand vision for Sterling Logistics, a vision I knew for a fact would bankrupt the company in less than 3 fiscal quarters if left to his own devices. He was a man composed entirely of bluster and inherited equity, possessing the business acumen of a distracted toddler, but the ego of a Roman emperor. As the dessert plates were being cleared by the silent, invisible waitstaff, Robert leaned back in his tufted leather chair and patted his stomach expansively. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a gold-plated guillotine cigar cutter, turning it over in his thick fingers. He looked toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room, then glanced out the window at the driving, freezing rain, a look of profound annoyance crossing his flushed, meaty face. He wanted his post-dinner smoke, but he certainly wasn't going to brave the elements to get it. Robert's eyes scanned the room, bypassing the hired help, and landed precisely where they always did when he needed a menial task completed without having to say please or thank you. They landed on me. Snap. Snap. The sound of his heavy fingers snapping together cut through the ambient chatter of the room like a whip crack. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times over the last 6 years. It was the sound you use to summon a disobedient dog or a valet who has kept you waiting. "Elias!" Robert barked, not bothering to lower his voice, ensuring the entire table paused to watch his display of dominance. "My humidor is in the glove box of the Bentley. The Cohibas, not the Monte Cristos. The keys are in the pocket of my overcoat in the foyer. Run out and fetch them for me, will you?" He didn't phrase it as a question. It was a royal decree. He casually tossed his gold-plated cigar cutter onto the mahogany table, fully expecting me to leap up from my plastic chair, fetch his keys, brave the freezing downpour in my only decent suit, and return shivering to hand him his luxury tobacco so he could blow the smoke in my face. For 6 years, that is exactly what I would have done. I would have swallowed the bitter, burning bile in my throat, stood up, smiled a weak, accommodating smile, and trotted out into the rain. I would have done it because I believed that enduring the abuse was the price of admission to Vanessa's heart. I would have done it to keep the fragile, illusory peace of this wretched family intact. I looked at the gold cutter resting on the polished wood. I looked at the freezing rain violently pelting the massive windows. And then I looked at Robert. I felt a profound, almost euphoric sense of calm wash over my entire nervous system. The fraying thread that had held my subservience together hadn't just snapped, it had disintegrated into dust. There was no fear left. There was no anxiety about rocking the boat. The boat was already sinking, and I was the only one who knew how to swim. No, the word left my mouth quietly, but in the sudden lull of the dining room's conversation, it sounded like a gunshot. It was a single, flat, emotionless syllable, devoid of anger, devoid of apology. Just a simple, absolute refusal. For a terrifying, stretched-out second, the universe seemed to pause. Jackson, my nephew, stopped. Throw with a fistful of cranberry sauce. A cousin at the far end of the table froze with a forkful of pecan pie halfway to her mouth. The smooth jazz playing from the hidden speakers suddenly felt obnoxiously loud. Robert blinked, his thick brow furrowing as if I had suddenly started speaking to him in ancient Aramaic. The concept of me denying a direct order was so alien to his reality that his brain legitimately struggled to process the auditory information. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Robert asked, leaning forward, the jovial, expansive patriarch facade cracking instantly to reveal the petty, vicious tyrant underneath. "I said no, Robert," I repeated, my voice steady, my eyes locked dead onto his. "I am not fetching your cigars. If you want to smoke in the rain, you can walk out there and get them yourself." The acoustic death of the room was absolute. The silence was so heavy, so suffocating, that you could hear the soft hiss of the central heating pushing air through the vents. Julian's mouth hung open slightly, his wineglass hovering motionless in the air. Beside me, the air shifted violently as Vanessa realized what was happening. Her head snapped toward me so fast I thought she might get whiplash. The beautiful manicured mask she wore for her family slipped entirely, revealing a twisted, venomous panic. She leaned over her chair, her nails digging into the white linen tablecloth, and aimed a furious, hushed hiss in my direction. "Elias, what the hell are you doing?" she whispered aggressively, her eyes wide and terrifying. "Stop it, right now. Get up and go get the cigars. You are embarrassing me in front of everyone." I slowly turned my head to look at the woman I had married. I looked at the dark green silk dress I had bought her, the diamond earrings she had demanded for her last birthday, the flawless makeup masking the absolute void of empathy underneath. I searched my heart for that familiar pang of desperate devotion, that pathetic urge to please her, to make her proud of me. There was nothing there, just a cold, echoing emptiness. The love I had harbored for her had been starved to death over 1,000 family dinners just like this one, bled dry by 1,000 rolled eyes and dismissive sighs. "I'm embarrassing you?" I asked, my voice calm, conversational, but loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Julian just toasted to my status as the family nanny while I sat in a plastic chair eating a cold chicken nugget, and you laughed. But me refusing to be your father's personal errand boy in a freezing rainstorm is what embarrasses you?" Vanessa's face went chalk white. She wasn't used to me fighting back, let alone doing it publicly, holding up a mirror to her own complicity. "Know your place, Elias," she spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and genuine shock. "You are ruining Thanksgiving. Go. Get the cigars." "My place," I said softly, looking away from her and back to the head of the table, "is exactly where I choose to be." Robert had heard enough. The initial shock had fully metabolized into a blinding, volcanic rage. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his starched white collar. The idea that the charity case, the penniless orphan his daughter had dragged into their pristine bloodline, was openly defying him, was a psychological insult he simply could not abide. He pushed his heavy mahogany chair back with a violent, scraping screech against the imported hardwood floor. He stood up to his full height, looming over the table, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of plum purple. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little parasite," Robert bellowed, his voice booming off the walls, the gentlemanly veneer entirely stripped away. "I have tolerated your presence in this house for 6 years. I have allowed you to eat my food, drink my wine, and sleep under a roof paid for by my family's name. I let you play with the spreadsheets because it kept you out of the way. But do not ever mistake my tolerance for equality." He slammed his heavy fist onto the table, making the silverware jump and the crystal wine glasses rattle menacingly. "You are nothing," Robert roared, pointing a thick, trembling finger at me across the expanse of the room. "You are a stray dog we let into the kitchen out of pity. If you don't stand up right this second, walk your pathetic ass out the front door, and bring me my cigars, I swear to God Almighty, I will call my lawyers in the morning. I will cut Vanessa out of the trust entirely. I will rewrite the allocations, and I will leave the two of you with absolutely nothing. You will be back in whatever gutter she found you in." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. To the rest of the family, it was the ultimate trump card. Disinheritance, banishment from the empire. It was the nuclear option that kept every cousin, every sibling, every spouse in absolute terrified line. Vanessa gasped, a real, physical sound of terror, and reached out to grab my arm, her manicured claws digging painfully into my suit jacket. "Elias, please," she begged, the anger replaced by a desperate, pathetic panic at the thought of losing her endless credit limit. "Apologize. Apologize to him right now." I looked down at her hand, gripping my sleeve. I reached over, gently pried her fingers off my jacket, and dropped her hand back onto the table. Then I stood up. I didn't cower. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I stood up to my full 6'2" height, stretching my legs for the first time in 2 hours. As I rose, the back of my knees caught the edge of the tiny injection-molded plastic chair. With a deliberate, casual flick of my leg, I pushed backwards. The neon yellow chair tipped, hung in the air for a fraction of a second, and then clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. In the dead silence of the room, the cheap plastic smack sounded like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. I stepped over the fallen chair, Ignoring the spilled apple juice and the crushed peas, I smoothed the lapels of my cheap suit jacket, squared my shoulders, and began to walk. I didn't walk toward the foyer. I didn't walk toward the front door. I walked directly toward the main dining table, moving with a slow, methodical, predatory confidence that I had never displayed in their presence before. The family watched me approach as if I were a ghost. The cousins shrank back in their seats. Julian lowered his glass, his mocking smirk replaced by a confused, defensive scowl. Robert stood his ground at the head of the table, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, waiting for the apology he was absolutely certain was coming. I reached the massive mahogany table. I didn't stop. I walked slowly along the length of it, my eyes locked entirely on Robert. I passed the golden chargers, the half-empty bottles of Bordeaux, the crystal centerpieces. I passed Vanessa, who was staring at me with a mixture of horror and total incomprehension, realizing she was looking at a man she didn't actually know. I finally stopped when I was standing just a few feet away from Robert at the head of the table. The physical proximity was an open challenge, a blatant violation of his spatial dominance. I was close enough to smell the expensive cologne he bathed in, close enough to see the spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. "You're going to cut me out of the will, Robert?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying an edge so sharp it could have cut glass. "I will erase you," Robert spat, stepping forward, trying to use his bulk to intimidate me. "I will make it so you never existed in this family. Now get out of my dining room before I have the security team drag you out by your hair." I smiled. It was the same cold, dead smile I had given Julian a few minutes prior. I didn't back down an inch. "You can't cut me out of a will you don't control, Artie," I said softly, purposefully using the casual diminutive of his middle name, a massive sign of disrespect in his circles. "And you certainly can't kick me out of a dining room that you don't own." Robert's face contorted in sheer, unadulterated fury. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the disrespect. He raised a heavy, meaty hand, curling it into a fist, fully prepared to swing at me right there in front of the Thanksgiving turkey. "I'm going to break your jaw, you little—" Robert's threat was abruptly cut off. Before he could swing, before Julian could leap up to assist his father in the physical removal of the family pest, a sound echoed from the far end of the room that froze every single person in their tracks. It was the heavy, metallic clank of the iron latch on the main dining room doors disengaging. Everyone's head snapped toward the entrance. Even Robert lowered his fist, his rage momentarily short-circuited by the unexpected intrusion. The massive 10-foot-tall oak double doors groaned loudly as they were pushed open from the outside, swinging wide to reveal the dimly lit grand hallway beyond. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Standing in the threshold was Arthur Vance. If there was one person in the world who commanded more fear in the Sterling family than the late Grandpa Richard himself, it was Arthur Vance. He was the architect of their wealth, the keeper of their darkest corporate secrets, and the man who literally held the keys to the kingdom. He stood there impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray, bespoke three-piece suit that somehow looked completely dry despite the raging storm outside. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his wire-rimmed glasses caught the flickering light of the fireplace. He looked like the grim reaper of corporate law, utterly devoid of warmth, emotion, or mercy. But it wasn't just Vance that caused the collective breath of the room to hitch. Flanking the elderly attorney were two absolute mountains of men. They were private security contractors, former military by the look of their rigid posture and cold, scanning eyes. They were dressed in sharp, unmarked black tactical suits, the subtle bulge of holstered sidearms clearly visible under their jackets. They stepped into the dining room in perfect unison, their presence immediately dominating the opulent space, making the gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers seem suddenly very fragile. And in the grip of the contractor on the right was a heavy, reinforced black leather briefcase. It was secured with a dual combination biometric lock and a steel chain that attached directly to the guard's wrist. The shift in the room's psychological atmosphere was instantaneous and violent. In the span of a single heartbeat, my defiance, my refusal, my absolute disrespect, it all vanished from their minds like smoke in a hurricane. I ceased to exist. I was once again the invisible furniture in the room. Every pair of greedy, bloodshot eyes in the Sterling family locked onto that leather briefcase with the desperate, starving intensity of a pack of wolves looking at a wounded deer. They knew what was in that briefcase. Everyone did. It had been 32 days since Richard's death. The mandatory probate waiting period was over. That briefcase contained the final will and testament of Richard Sterling. It contained the shares, the properties, the trust funds, the offshore accounts. It contained the undisputed legal transfer of $4 billion. Robert's furious purple face instantly smoothed out. The raised fist dropped to his side. The raging tyrant vanished, instantly replaced by the obsequious, charming corporate air. He literally smoothed down the lapels of his suit jacket and took a step away from me, pasting on a wide, welcoming smile that looked sickeningly fake. "Arthur!" Robert boomed, his voice echoing across the room, completely ignoring the fact that he had been seconds away from a physical altercation. "What an unexpected surprise! We weren't expecting the formal reading until Monday at the firm. Please, come in out of the cold. Can I get you a glass of wine? Some scotch?" Vance didn't smile back. He didn't acknowledge the greeting. He simply stepped fully into the dining room, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood, the two armed behemoths trailing exactly one step behind him. Julian practically leaped out of his chair at the head of the table, his eyes darting frantically between Vance and the locked briefcase. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his face flushed with a new kind of adrenaline, the thrill of impending coronation. "Mr. Vance, it's an honor," Julian said, his voice dripping with sycophantic reverence. "I assume you're here to finally settle the grandfather's affairs? We've all been eagerly awaiting the transition of leadership so we can get the company moving forward again." Vanessa, too, had forgotten her embarrassment over my behavior. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes shining with greedy anticipation, practically vibrating with the thought of the expanded trust fund she was about to inherit. "I apologize for the intrusion on your holiday, Robert," Vance said. His voice was calm, gravelly, and entirely devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a man reading a death sentence. However, the circumstances regarding Richard's final stipulations required immediate, unannounced execution the moment the probate filing was verified by a judge. Of course, completely understandable." Robert nodded vigorously, stepping around me entirely as if I were a stain on the rug, extending a hand toward the lawyer. "We are ready, Arthur. The family is all here. Let's get this formality over with so we can toast to Richard's memory properly." Vance stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the dining table, looking out over the sea of eager, expectant faces. He didn't take Robert's outstretched hand. He just looked at it for a moment, then shifted his gaze slowly around the room. His eyes passed over Julian, who was practically bouncing on his heels. They passed over Vanessa, who was gripping her napkin in tight anticipation. And finally, Vance's cold gray eyes landed on me, standing quietly a few feet away from the patriarch. For a fraction of a second, the corner of Arthur Vance's mouth twitched upward in something that almost resembled a smile. He gave me a single, barely perceptible nod. "Set it down," Vance instructed the guard to his right. The massive contractor stepped forward, hoisted the heavy black briefcase onto the pristine white tablecloth right next to the remnants of the Thanksgiving turkey, and entered a biometric thumbprint. The steel chain detached. A heavy click echoed in the silent room as the latches disengaged. "The documents contained within this case," Vance began, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying weight of absolute legal finality, "constitute the final, ratified, and legally binding will and testament of Richard Alistair Sterling, drafted and signed 48 hours prior to his death." "Excellent," Robert beamed, rubbing his hands together. "Let's hear it, Arthur. Hand over the keys to the kingdom." Vance reached into the briefcase, his hands moving with slow, deliberate precision. "Very well, Robert," Vance said softly, pulling out a thick stack of heavy, cream-colored parchment paper bound by a thick gold seal. "Let us begin." Arthur Vance did not even blink at Robert's outstretched hand. He simply let it hang there in the empty air between them, a pathetic monument to Robert's evaporating authority. The silence in the dining room stretched, pulling taut like a piano wire about to snap. Slowly, awkwardly, Robert lowered his hand, a flush of embarrassed anger creeping up his thick neck, though he forced his rigid, fake smile to remain in place. Vance adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his movements deliberate, unhurried, and entirely in control of the room's gravity. He broke the thick gold wax seal on the cream-colored parchment with a sharp, dry crack that sounded like a fracturing bone. "The document I am about to read," Vance began, his voice echoing with absolute clinical detachment, "supersedes all previous testaments, trusts, and verbal agreements. It was drafted under my direct supervision, witnessed by 2 independent federal judges, and filed with the state probate court precisely 48 hours before Richard Alistair Sterling's passing. It is irrevocable. It is incontestable. And it is final." A collective, nervous breath was drawn around the table. Julian shifted his weight from foot to foot, licking his lips. Vanessa's fingers dug so hard into her linen napkin, I thought the fabric might tear. Even the rowdy nephews, Jackson and Leo, had gone completely still, sensing the heavy, suffocating shift in the room's atmosphere. I remained standing exactly where I was, a few feet from Robert, my hands casually resting in my pockets. I kept my face an emotionless mask, though my heart was hammering a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. Vance unfolded the heavy parchment. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't look at the family. He just began to read, projecting Richard's voice from beyond the grave with chilling accuracy. "I, Richard Alistair Sterling, being of sound mind and absolute clarity of purpose, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament. I have spent my life building an empire from dirt. I have built a fortress of wealth that should have lasted 1,000 years. Instead, I have spent the twilight of my life watching a cabal of parasites, sycophants, and imbeciles who unfortunately share my last name attempt to tear it down from the inside out." The fake smile on Robert's face vanished instantly, replaced by a look of stunned, wide-eyed shock. Julian let out a short, nervous scoff, looking around the table as if to say, "Classic Grandpa, always with the jokes." But no one laughed with him. The matriarch of the family, Julian's mother, gripped her diamond necklace, her face draining of color. "To my family," Vance read on, his tone merciless, "you have waited for my death like starving dogs waiting for the butcher to drop a scrap of meat. You have assumed that blood entitles you to the fruits of my labor. You are entirely incorrect. This document serves as the final correction of my greatest failure, my offspring." Vance paused, letting the sheer brutality of the words settle over the mahogany table. The room was so quiet. I could hear the rain lashing against the glass and the soft, terrified wheeze of Robert's breathing. "Let us begin with the allocations," Vance said, his eyes flicking down to the parchment. "To my eldest son, Robert." Robert instinctively stood a little taller, puffing out his chest, desperately clinging to the delusion that his father's harsh preamble was directed at the others, not the heir apparent. He adjusted his silk tie, ready to accept the mantle of leadership. "Robert," Vance read, "you are a man who was born on third base and spent your entire life congratulating yourself for hitting a triple. You possess the business acumen of a concussed pigeon and the arrogance of a medieval king. For 5 years, I have watched you hemorrhage capital from the logistics division to fund your absurd vanity projects. I have watched you illegally leverage our shipping fleet to cover your grotesque operational deficits." Robert gasped, a wet, choking sound, as if the air had just been punched out of his lungs. He stumbled backward half a step, bumping into his heavy leather chair. That's impossible," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically to Vance, then to Julian, then anywhere but the lawyer. "He couldn't have known that. I buried those ledgers. He stopped, realizing he had just confessed out loud in front of the entire family. Vance did not look up. He continued reading. Relentless. "Because I refuse to allow you to bankrupt the legacy I built, your position as chairman is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, all access to corporate funds, trust accounts, and company assets is revoked. For your inheritance, Robert, I leave you exactly $1 to be paid in pennies and a framed copy of your Q3 Catalyst earnings report. May it serve as a permanent reminder of your staggering, breathtaking incompetence." Vance paused, reaching his hand out to the security contractor on his left. The behemoth in the tactical suit unzipped a flat, black canvas bag he had slung over his shoulder and pulled out a simple, cheap black frame. Inside the frame was the exact Q3 earnings report I had audited, the one that proved Robert had nearly destroyed the company. The bottom line was circled in bright red marker by Richard himself. The guard stepped forward and placed the framed document face up on the table, right next to Robert's gold-plated cigar cutter. Next to the frame, he placed a single, crumpled $1 bill. "This is a joke," Robert whispered, his voice trembling violently. His face had gone from plum purple to a sickening ashen gray. "This is a forged document. My father would never. He promised me the company. I am the eldest son. I demand to see the signature. Arthur, you will not get away with this." "The signature is authenticated, Robert," Vance said coldly, untouched by the man's unraveling sanity. "And the financial leverage you utilized illegally has already been reported to the corporate board. By morning, you will likely be facing a massive civil suit from the shareholders. I suggest you use that dollar to call a defense attorney." Robert's knees buckled. He collapsed heavily into his tufted leather chair, his thick hands gripping his hair, staring blankly at the framed report on the table. The untouchable patriarch, the tyrant who had demanded I fetch his cigars in the freezing rain just 5 minutes ago, was gone. In his place was a broken, terrified old man staring into the abyss of absolute ruin. The dining room descended into a chaotic murmur of panic. The cousins began whispering furiously to each other. Julian's mother let out a loud, theatrical sob. "Silence," Vance commanded. The word wasn't shouted, but it carried the concussive force of a gavel. The room instantly obeyed. "Julian," recovering from the shock of his father's public execution, suddenly puffed out his chest. The nervous energy morphed back into that toxic, golden boy arrogance. In Julian's warped, narcissistic mind, the math was simple. If Robert was cut out, that meant the trust didn't have to be split. That meant he, the prodigy, was getting everything. "Well," Julian said, clearing his throat, attempting to project a somber tone that completely failed to hide his eager, greedy grin. "It's a tragedy about my father's mismanagement, truly. But Grandpa Richard always knew I had the pulse of the modern market. I'm ready to step up, Mr. Vance. What are the allocations for the investment division?" Vance finally looked up from the parchment. He looked dead into Julian's eyes. The absolute void of empathy in the lawyer's gaze actually made Julian take a half-step backward. "To my grandson, Julian," Vance read, his voice dropping into a register of pure, icy contempt. "You have spent your entire life pretending to be a wolf when in reality, you are nothing but a well-dressed leech. You believed you were a financial prodigy, but your only true talent is failing upwards, cushioned by the wealth I built." Julian's grin faltered. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline, catching the light of the chandelier. "But incompetence is a family trait I can almost forgive," Vance continued reading. "Thievery, however, I cannot." The word hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his starched collar. "Thievery," he squeaked, his voice cracking. I don't know what he means. I've grown the portfolios." "You are a thief, Julian," Vance read, Richard's vitriol echoing off the walls. "Did you truly believe you could siphon $120 million from the employee pension funds without me finding out? Did you think your pathetic shell companies in the Cayman Islands were invisible? Did you think I would let you steal the retirement of the men and women who load my ships to pay for your cocaine and your sports cars?" Julian's face went completely, hauntingly white. The blood drained from his extremities so fast he swayed on his feet, reaching out to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. "No," he whispered, a sound of absolute, naked terror. "No, no, no, the firewalls! The ledgers were clean! Someone framed me!" His wild, terrified eyes shot across the table and locked onto me. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't look at me like I was a joke. He looked at me like I was the Grim Reaper. He finally understood who had built the algorithms. He finally understood who had audited his shadow accounts. "To Julian," Vance concluded, "I leave absolutely nothing of monetary value. You are stripped of your title, your shares, and your trust fund." Vance reached out his other hand. The second security contractor stepped forward, holding a thick, unmarked manila folder. He held it out to Julian. Julian's hands were shaking so violently he could barely grasp the cardboard. He opened it slowly, as if it contained a live explosive. "In that folder, Julian," Vance stated smoothly, abandoning the reading for a moment to address the weeping man directly, "is a copy of the complete digital forensic dossier detailing every wire transfer, every forged signature, and every encrypted account you used to drain the pension fund. It is a masterpiece of financial tracking." Julian stared at the first page, his eyes rolling back slightly. "I am providing you this copy," Vance said, his voice void of all mercy, "so that you can read it before your arraignment. Because exactly 1 hour ago, the original dossier was hand-delivered to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as the Securities and Exchange Commission. The accounts have been frozen. Your passport has been flagged. There is a federal warrant being drafted for your arrest as we speak." Julian dropped the folder. The papers spilled across the floor, stark white against the dark wood. He didn't scream. He didn't protest. His brain simply shut down under the weight of his impending incarceration. He sank to his knees right there on the floor, weeping openly, loudly, clutching his face in his hands, gasping for air between pathetic, shuddering sobs. The invincible golden boy, the man who had mocked me from his throne, was now a crumpled, crying mess on the floor, waiting for the feds to kick in the door. The dining room was in pandemonium. Julian's mother had fainted, slumping over sideways into her chair. The cousins were scrambling, looking at each other in sheer panic, realizing the limitless bank vault they had fed from their entire lives had just been slammed shut and locked from the inside. Vanessa, however, had not fainted. She was standing perfectly straight, her chest heaving, her eyes darting between her broken father and her weeping brother. Survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of ruthless social climbing, kicked in. She realized the Sterling men had been slaughtered, but she, the only daughter, the one with the ironclad trust and the prenuptial agreement, was still standing. She looked at Vance, her face hardening into a mask of desperate defiance. "My grandfather was clearly misled about my father and my brother," Vanessa said, her voice shaking but loud enough to cut through Julian's sobbing. "But my trust is separate. My allocations are protected by the primary bylaws, and Elias—" She turned to me, her eyes flashing with a sudden manipulative warmth, a desperate attempt to reel me back into her sinking ship. She reached her hand out toward me. "Elias is my husband. We are a team. Whatever happens, the core estate defaults to my line." I looked at her outstretched hand. I thought about the thousands of times I had reached out to her for support, for love, for just a shred of basic human decency, only to have my hand slapped away. I didn't move a muscle. I just stared at her, letting the cold, dead silence in my eyes give her the answer. Her hand slowly dropped to her side, the manipulative warmth fracturing into genuine, creeping dread. "To my granddaughter Vanessa," Vance's voice rang out, slicing through her desperate delusion. Vanessa's head snapped back to the lawyer. "You have always believed that your beauty and your name were a substitute for character," Vance read, the parchment rustling in his hands. "You believed that you could treat people like disposable assets. You treated your own marriage as a convenient shield for your vanity." Vanessa swallowed hard, her chin trembling. "What is he talking about?" she demanded, looking around the room. "I have been a perfect wife. I have upheld the family image. Your inheritance, Vanessa, along with the continuation of your primary trust, was contingent upon a strict moral fidelity clause embedded within the Sterling family charter," Vance read, his eyes narrowing slightly. "A clause that I had private investigators verify over the last 6 months of my life." The color drained from Vanessa's face so fast, I thought she might actually join her mother in a dead faint. She stumbled back, hitting the edge of the table. "No," Vanessa breathed, shaking her head frantically. "No, he wouldn't. He couldn't." "The investigators," Vance continued relentlessly, "provided me with 74 pages of time-stamped photographs, hotel receipts, and intercepted communications detailing your ongoing 2-year affair with Marcus Thorne, the vice president of our direct competitor, Apex Logistics." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Robert looked up from his catatonic state, staring at his daughter in horror. Not because she had cheated on her husband. He didn't care about me. But because she had been sleeping with the enemy. A breach of corporate loyalty that was unforgivable in their world. I didn't gasp. I didn't react at all. I had suspected the affair for over a year. The late-night marketing meetings. The mysterious weekend spa trips where she was unreachable. The sudden changes in her phone passwords. I had known, but I had buried it deep down in the dark, pathetic part of my soul that was desperate to keep the marriage alive. But Grandpa Richard hadn't just suspected it. He had documented it, weaponized it, and loaded it into the chamber for this exact moment. Because of this flagrant violation of the fidelity clause, and the massive security risk you pose to the company," Vance read, raising his voice slightly to drown out Vanessa's sudden, hysterical sobbing. "Your prenuptial agreement is hereby triggered and immediately dissolved. You are stripped of all trust allocations, properties, and stipends. You leave this marriage and this family with exactly what you brought into it, nothing but your arrogance." Vanessa let out a guttural, wretched scream. It wasn't a scream of heartbreak. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated financial terror. The realization that she was no longer an heiress, that the black cards were dead, that the designer clothes and the luxury cars were gone forever, hit her like a physical blow. She lunged toward me, her hands grappling at my suit jacket, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, streaking her expensive makeup. "Elias!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "Elias, please! You have to stop this! Tell him it's a lie! We can fix this! We can fight this together! I love you! I made a mistake! Please, Elias!" I looked down at the woman who had let her family treat me like a dog for 6 years. I looked at the woman who had just moments ago demanded I go out into the freezing rain to fetch a cigar to save her own embarrassment. I reached up, took her wrists in my hands, and gripped them tightly. She looked up at me, a flicker of hopeful relief in her tear-drowned eyes, thinking she had manipulated me one last time. "Vanessa," I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly level. "Just keep the peace." I let go of her wrists and took a step back. The words hit her with the kinetic force of a freight train. She realized I was quoting her exact command from the beginning of dinner. She realized I had known everything. She realized she was staring at a man who felt absolutely nothing for her anymore. She let out a hollow, shattered sob, sinking to the floor, her dark green silk dress pooling around her like a puddle. She sat there in the ruins of her life, weeping next to her brother. The dining room was a graveyard. The mighty Sterling family, the untouchable titans of industry, had been systematically slaughtered in the span of 10 minutes. They were broken, weeping, and entirely disinherited. But the reading wasn't over. Vance cleared his throat. It was a sharp, loud sound that commanded the final shreds of attention in the room. The weeping subsided into terrified, breathless anticipation. There was still a massive $4 billion question hanging in the air. If the sons were disinherited and the daughter was cut out, where did the empire go? Was it liquidated, donated to charity, absorbed by the state? "We come now to the final allocation," Vance announced, his voice carrying a strange, almost reverent tone that I had never heard him use before. "The disposition of the core estate, the controlling shares of Sterling Logistics, the liquid capital, the offshore holdings, and the physical properties." Robert dragged his eyes up from the floor, his face twisted in a mask of desperate, feral curiosity. Julian stopped sobbing long enough to listen. Even Vanessa looked up through her ruined makeup. "I have watched my bloodline fail," Vance read, the final words of Richard Sterling ringing out like a bell tolling the end of an era. "But I have also watched a man stand in the shadows, holding the pillars of this empire up with his bare hands, while the rest of you tried to tear them down. I have watched a man endure your cruelty, your mockery, and your staggering ignorance with the quiet, terrifying patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike." The room went dead silent. Only the rain outside dared to make a sound. "I leave the entirety of the Sterling Empire," Vance read, locking his cold gray eyes directly onto mine, "to the only man in this room who actually possesses the intellect, the ruthlessness, and the vision to wield it." Vance took a deep breath, letting the anticipation stretch until it was almost physically painful for the family to endure. The sole beneficiary of the remaining $4.2 billion estate, the supervoting shares of Sterling Logistics, and the deed to this very mansion is Elias." The name dropped into the silence of the dining room like a live hand grenade. For 3 full seconds, nobody breathed. The reality of the words simply refused to compute in the minds of the Sterling family. The charity case, the janitor, the man they had literally banished to a tiny plastic chair at the children's table not 30 minutes ago, was now the absolute, undisputed owner of their entire universe. Then the grenade detonated. The reaction was a shockwave of sheer, primal insanity. It was the sound of a dynasty violently collapsing in on itself. Julian screamed, a high-pitched, wordless wail of pure agony, pulling at his own hair, rocking back and forth on the floor. The cousins erupted into furious, hysterical shouting, demanding lawyers, demanding the police, screaming that it was a forgery, a coup, a lie. Vanessa simply went catatonic, her mouth hanging open, staring at me as if I had just taken off a human mask to reveal a monster underneath. But it was Robert who truly snapped. The final shred of his sanity, the last bastion of his colossal ego, completely shattered. The absolute humiliation of losing his father's empire to the stray dog he had tormented was a psychological break he could not survive. He let out a roar that sounded more animal than human. It was a bellow of pure, homicidal rage. He launched himself out of his chair, his massive frame hurtling across the mahogany table. He didn't care about the money anymore. He didn't care about the company. He just wanted to wrap his thick, meaty hands around my throat and squeeze until my eyes popped out of my skull. He scrambled over the table, kicking over half-empty bottles of $1,000 wine, sending crystal glasses shattering against the walls. He crushed the Thanksgiving turkey under his knee, sending gravy flying across the room. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely insane. "I'll kill you!" Robert roared, spit flying from his lips as he lunged toward me, arms outstretched, his massive hands aiming for my neck. "I'll kill you, you parasitic little bastard! I'll tear your head off!" I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I didn't even take my hands out of my pockets. I just stood there, perfectly still, watching him come. He never made it off the table. Before Robert could even clear the edge of the mahogany wood, the 2 security contractors moved. They didn't shout warnings. They didn't hesitate. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized speed of apex predators. The guard on the right stepped forward, reached out a massive gloved hand, and grabbed Robert by the lapel of his tailored Italian suit. With a singular, effortless motion that defied the older man's immense bulk, the guard violently yanked Robert forward and down. At the exact same moment, the guard on the left stepped in, driving the rigid forearm of his tactical suit directly into the back of Robert's neck. The impact was brutal. Robert's face slammed down into the polished mahogany table with a sickening crack, right next to the framed copy of his failed earnings report and the single, crumpled dollar bill. The crystal centerpieces rattled violently from the force of the blow. Before Robert could even register the pain, both guards descended on him. They pinned his arms behind his back with bone-snapping force, driving their knees into his spine, compressing his lungs until he let out a choked, wet gasp for air. They held him there, completely neutralized, his face mashed into a puddle of spilled cranberry sauce and shattered crystal. "Subject is secured," one of the guards said calmly, his voice devoid of adrenaline, not even breathing hard. He looked up at Vance for further instructions. The dining room descended back into a horrified, whimpering silence. The violent physical subjugation of the patriarch broke the last remaining spirit of the family. The cousins backed away toward the walls, terrified. Julian curled into a fetal position under a side table. I slowly pulled my hands out of my pockets. I walked forward, stepping over the shattered glass and the ruined food until I was standing right next to the table, looking down at Robert. His face was turned sideways, pressed hard against the wood, a thin line of blood trickling from his nose, mixing with the cranberry sauce. He was gasping for air, his eyes rolling up to look at me, filled with a mixture of agony hatred, and, finally, beautifully, fear. I reached out, picked up his gold-plated cigar cutter from the table, and twirled it slowly between my fingers. "You're right about one thing, Artie," I said, my voice quiet, carrying effortlessly over the terrified whimpering of the room. "The Cohibas are much better than the Monte Cristos, but I think I'll have the staff fetch them for me later." I tossed the gold cutter onto the floor, right next to his face. Then, I turned my back on him. I looked at Arthur Vance, who was calmly placing the heavy parchment documents back into the black leather briefcase. "The reading is concluded," Vance announced to the room, snapping the briefcase shut and spinning the combination lock. "The transfer of assets is immediate and absolute. As of this exact moment, Elias is the sole owner of the Sterling estate." I looked out over the ruined dining room. I looked at the weeping, shattered remnants of the people who had treated me like garbage for 6 years. I looked at the tiny, neon yellow plastic chair lying tipped over on the floor. I took a deep breath. The air in the mansion suddenly felt incredibly clean. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice echoing with a new, terrifying authority. "It seems we have a significant trespassing issue." "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice echoing with a new, terrifying authority. "It seems we have a significant trespassing issue." Arthur Vance adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his face an unreadable mask of professional stone. "Indeed we do, Elias. How would you like to proceed?" I turned away from the lawyer and faced the wreckage of the Sterling family. The dining room, once a monument to their untouchable status and generational arrogance, now looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster. The cousins were huddled in the far corners like frightened livestock, whispering in panicked, frantic tones. Julian was still curled on the expensive Persian rug, softly whimpering into his knees, completely shattered by the looming threat of federal prison. Robert, the former tyrant, was pinned to the mahogany table, his face smeared with a sickening mixture of cranberry sauce and his own blood, breathing in ragged, defeated gasps beneath the crushing weight of the security contractor. And then there was Vanessa, sitting in a puddle of her ruined silk dress, staring at me with a hollow, incomprehensible expression. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the massive table. Every step I took echoed in the dead silence of the room. I let the reality of the moment sink deep into their bones. I wanted them to feel the absolute, suffocating weight of their new reality before I threw them out into the cold. "For 6 years, I began, my voice calm, steady, and loud enough to reach every terrified corner of the cavernous room. "I sat in this house and watched you operate. I watched you bleed this company dry. I watched you steal, cheat, and aggressively mismanage an empire that Richard spent 50 years building with his own 2 hands. And for 6 years you let me fix your catastrophic mistakes, utterly convinced that my silence was a symptom of my weakness." I stopped walking and looked down at Julian. He flinched, pulling his knees tighter to his chest, trying to make himself as small as possible. "Julian," I said, the name dripping with absolute disgust. "You thought you were a genius because you knew how to use offshore shell companies. You thought the algorithms you paid millions for were untraceable. But you forgot one crucial detail. I was the one who built the internal auditing software for the firm. I didn't just find your embezzling. I engineered the system to track every single cent you stole the exact moment you tried to hide it. I let you keep stealing. I let you build your own cage, wire transfer by wire transfer, until the door was heavy enough to lock you away for the rest of your natural life." I stepped over a shattered crystal wine glass and moved toward the head of the table, looking down at Robert. "And you, Artie," I murmured, watching his bloodshot eyes roll up to look at me in sheer terror. "You thought leverage was power. You thought you could mortgage the fleet and forge the board's signatures because nobody would dare question the great Robert Sterling. But you didn't realize that every time you handed me a ledger to clean up your messes, you were handing me the exact weapon I needed to destroy you. You gave me the bullets, Robert. I just loaded the gun." I looked around the room, taking in the pale, terrified faces of the extended family. Your arrogance was a disease. It blinded you to everything. You were so utterly convinced of your inherent genetic superiority that you didn't even bother to look down. You seated the architect of your destruction at a plastic toddler's table, handed him a juice box, and laughed. You handed me the keys to the kingdom because you were too busy admiring your own reflections to realize I had already changed the locks. Movement caught my eye. Vanessa was struggling to her feet. Her dark green silk dress, the one I had saved up for months to buy her, was stained with spilled wine and trampled food. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. Her makeup was ruined, black mascara tracking down her pale cheeks like dirty tears. But as she stood, a chilling transformation occurred. The panic in her eyes receded slightly, replaced by a desperate, calculated warmth, the survival instinct of a cornered predator. She took a step toward me, her hands clasped together in a posture of pleading, manufactured vulnerability. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling, laced with a practiced sorrow. "Elias, baby, please listen to me." She took another step, reaching out a trembling hand. I didn't move away. I let her approach. I wanted to see exactly how far she was willing to debase herself to keep her platinum credit limit active. This is a shock," Vanessa stammered, tears welling in her eyes, genuine tears, born of financial terror, not heartbreak. "I know you're angry. I know you're hurt. And you have every right to be. They treated you terribly. My father, my brother, they were monsters to you. I see that now. But I never wanted this. You have to believe me, Elias. I always knew you were brilliant. I always knew you were destined for greatness." She stopped a few feet away, looking up at me through wet eyelashes. "We are a team, Elias," she pleaded, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. "We are husband and wife. Whatever happened with Marcus, it was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake. He meant nothing to me. It was just the stress, the pressure of this family. It made me crazy. But it's just you and me now. We have the company, we have the estate. We can run it together, just like we always dreamed. Please, baby, don't throw away what we have over a mistake." She reached out and gently touched the lapel of my suit jacket, her fingers tracing the cheap fabric as if it were spun gold. I looked down at her hand. Then I looked up into her eyes. There was no love there. There was no remorse. There was only a desperate, starving parasite frantically trying to reattach itself to a new, vastly wealthier host. I reached up and grabbed her wrist. I didn't squeeze hard, but I held it firmly enough that she couldn't pull away. The fake warmth in her eyes instantly shattered, replaced by a flicker of genuine, primal fear. "A team," I repeated, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "We're a team." "Yes," she gasped, nodding frantically, a desperate smile forcing its way onto her lips. "Yes, Elias, we are." "Where was my teammate when Julian was mocking me in front of the entire family?" I asked, my grip tightening slightly. "Where was my teammate when I was banished to a plastic chair eating cold chicken nuggets? Where was she when I was working until 3 a.m. to save her brother from federal prison?" Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, to spin another frantic lie, but I cut her off. "I'll tell you where she was," I said softly, staring a hole directly through her soul. She was rolling her eyes. She was telling me to keep the peace. She was in a luxury hotel room with a direct competitor, laughing at the pathetic charity case she kept at home to do the taxes. "Elias, no, please." "You want to know my place, Vanessa?" I asked, quoting her own venomous words back to her, watching the last remaining color completely drain from her face. "My place is exactly where I choose to be. And you? You are an embarrassment to me." I let go of her wrist and shoved her hand away with a look of utter, profound repulsion. She stumbled backward, gasping as if I had physically struck her in the chest. "The prenup is dissolved, Vanessa," I stated, my voice turning to absolute ice. "You get nothing, no alimony, no settlement, no house. You walk out of here with the clothes on your back and the knowledge that you threw away a $4 billion empire for a cheap hotel affair." I turned away from her sobbing, collapsing form and addressed the entire room. This estate, the grounds, and everything contained within these walls now belong entirely to me, I announced, my voice booming off the vaulted ceilings. You are all officially trespassing on private property. I raised my left arm and pulled back the cuff of my jacket, checking the cheap stainless steel watch I had worn since my college days. You have exactly 15 minutes, I declared. 15 minutes to go to your respective rooms, pack exactly one suitcase of personal clothing, and walk out the front door. If you attempt to take any jewelry, any art, any electronics, or anything purchased with company funds, you will be arrested for grand larceny. If you are still on this property in 16 minutes, the private security contractors here will physically remove you, and I will have Arthur call the police to press charges for criminal trespassing. The absolute finality of the decree hung in the air. For a moment, nobody moved. The shock was too profound. Then, the buzzing started. It began as a low, muffled vibration coming from Robert's inside jacket pocket. Then Julian's jacket began to buzz. Then Vanessa's clutch purse dropped on the floor near the table, lit up with notifications. Then the cousin's phones started chiming, a cascade of sharp electronic pings. It was a symphony of financial ruin. Arthur Vance had not been idle. The moment the reading concluded, his legal team had executed the massive asset freezes. The notifications were coming in real time. Platinum credit cards declining, offshore bank accounts locked, trust funds frozen, access completely denied. The digital guillotine was falling, severing them forever from the wealth that had defined their entire existence. Robert let out a muffled, strangled cry from beneath the guard's knee as his smart watch vibrated furiously against his wrist. He knew exactly what the alerts meant. He was witnessing the real-time evaporation of his entire identity. "Let him up," I told the security contractor. The massive guard released the pressure and took a sharp step back. Robert didn't leap up. He didn't try to attack me again. He pushed himself off the ruined table slowly, his arms trembling violently, his face a swollen, bloody mess. He looked at his vibrating watch, his breath coming in short, hyperventilating gasps. He couldn't get enough oxygen. The panic attack was fully setting in. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely vacant. 15 minutes, Artie, I reminded him coldly. The clock is ticking. The panic finally broke through the paralysis. The cousins scrambled first, pushing past each other in a desperate stampede for the heavy oak doors, sprinting toward the guest wings to grab whatever meager belongings they could fit into a single bag before they were thrown out into the storm. Julian didn't move. He couldn't. He just stayed curled on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, waiting for the FBI to arrive. The second security contractor grabbed him by the scruff of his expensive tailored collar, hauled him to his feet effortlessly, and began dragging him toward the foyer like a sack of garbage. Julian's expensive leather shoes dragged uselessly against the hardwood floor, leaving scuff marks he would never be able to afford to fix. Robert staggered after him, wheezing, clutching his chest, his eyes fixed on the vibrating phone in his hand, as if it were a live bomb he didn't know how to defuse. Vanessa was the last to go. She refused to move. She sat on the floor, weeping, screaming my name, begging for a second chance, begging for a lawyer, begging for a single dollar to call a cab. I didn't answer. I just looked at the first security contractor and gave a slight nod. The guard stepped forward, grabbed Vanessa by the arm, and pulled her forcefully to her feet. She shrieked, thrashing against his iron grip, her manicured nails clawing uselessly at his tactical vest. "No! No! This is my house! You can't do this to me! Elias! Elias, please!" Her screams echoed down the long, marble hallway as the guard physically dragged her out of the dining room. I walked slowly to the massive double doors and watched the spectacle unfold in the grand foyer. The front doors of the mansion were thrown wide open. The freezing November rain was blowing sideways into the entryway, soaking the imported Persian rugs. The guard shoved Julian out into the storm. He collapsed on the wet pavement of the driveway, instantly soaked to the bone, weeping into the freezing mud. Robert stumbled out after him, shivering violently in his ruined suit, his phone finally going dead in his hand as the last of his accounts were seized. And then the guard dragged Vanessa to the threshold. She dug her heels into the marble, screaming one final, desperate plea, her face twisted in a mask of absolute, unadulterated despair. The guard gave one final, powerful shove. Vanessa stumbled backward, her heels catching on the stone steps, and she fell hard onto the wet gravel of the driveway. The freezing rain instantly plastered her dark green silk dress to her shivering skin. The massive, heavy, iron-wrought doors swung shut with a resounding, thunderous boom. The heavy deadbolts clicked into place with a definitive snap. The screaming was instantly cut off. The storm was silenced. I stood in the grand foyer for a long moment, listening to the absolute, pristine quiet of the empty mansion. There was no booming laughter. There was no mocking banter. There was no crying, no complaining, no suffocating entitlement. There was just silence, and it belonged entirely to me. I turned around and walked slowly back into the dining room. I stepped over the overturned neon yellow toddler chair, leaving it to rot on the floor. I walked past the ruined table, past the shattered crystal and the spilled wine, and made my way to the antique mahogany bar cart nestled in the corner. I reached out and picked up the heavy crystal decanter containing Grandpa Richard's 50-year-old Macallan single malt. I poured a generous heavy measure into a pristine rocks glass. I carried the glass over to the head of the massive 20-foot dining table. I pulled back Robert's heavy, tufted leather chair. I sat down, the leather creaking softly under my weight. I stretched my long legs out beneath the table, relishing the infinite space, my knees miles away from my chin. I raised the glass to the empty room, to the ghost of the ruthless old man who had given me the weapon, and to the beautiful, unbroken silence of my new empire. I took a slow, deliberate sip. It was the best damn thing I had ever tasted.